So tonight, our speakers are going to chat for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have a question and answer session afterwards. You'll see at the bottom of the page a Q&A section, and that's where you can write your questions. And after they've been chatting, I will come back on and select some of them to read aloud for our guest to answer. So we'll go a little longer than anticipated, till about 7:15 or so. I hope you'll still be able to be with us, at least from the comfort of your home. You can eat and drink and get up. Usually I say silence your cell phones, but your phones can go off now. Except panelists, you have to silence yours.
Oh yeah.
This is the opportunity I have also to thank the many people who donate to our annual fund each year. It's a huge part in normal situations of making our year-round programming available to people, but our annual fund dollars mean more now than ever, as you can imagine, because we've lost ticket revenue from our events, and our annual fundraising event has had to be postponed. We're going to try to do some sort of something in August rather than June. Who knows? But we're trying to pivot to this digital environment as best we can, where we can, like this chat, as well as being more active on social media, and hopefully soon to do some live streaming of music. So on to our talk. This is a new series we've entitled Media Matters, sort of a double meaning there. And we're delighted to partner with The Day, our region's newspaper, which will be the media sponsor for this series. In this era where the phrase fake news has become far too commonplace, we think our society can benefit when we hear more from esteemed journalists who work their tails off, reporting about all sorts of things that we think contribute to a functioning democracy. And especially now when our world faces this really dreadful pandemic. Sadly, the financial model for the news business is severely challenged right now, as are other sectors. But that's why $5 of your ticket price will go to support the COVID-19 local news fund. And I urge you, if you don't yet subscribe to your local newspaper, wherever you are, please consider doing so. The person interviewing our guest tonight is one of those esteemed journalists, Maura Casey. Her full bio, which was on your ticketing page, is an impressive one. But chiefly, I'd like you to know that she worked for The Day here in our region for 17 years and spent much of her career as an editorial writer, including for the New York Times. I love that. Just think of it. She was paid for writing opinions. A great job.
Fun, baby.
Maura has been kind enough to give us advice on this series as we go forward, and I thank her for her wisdom and insight. And we take a brief pause for that virtual applause that we can't hear. Our guest tonight is Julie Wernau, and this is a little bit of a local girl done good story. She's originally from Waterford, Connecticut, and spent the early part of her career reporting for The Day, and then went to the Chicago Tribune. She currently writes for the Wall Street Journal, and had the distinction of joining more than a dozen other American journalists in having her credentials revoked from China in March, while she was reporting from Beijing. She was back in our region last month visiting family as she self-quarantined, and is coming to us tonight from Chicago, where she is now based, writing for the Wall Street Journal. We're so delighted she's agreed to chat with us, and both of them have been so gracious about our technical difficulties. We're going to chat a little bit about her career and her experience in China. And I'm going to now turn it over to Maura while I disappear for a bit, and I'll come back for questions. Take it away, Maura.
All right, through the wonder of Zoom. Thank you, Julie. Great to talk to you. You are the local kid done good. Tell me now, you're the youngest child, right? Which, as another youngest sibling, I'm kind of a little smug about that. Tell me a little bit about that. Your family here.
Yeah, so I grew up in Waterford, went to Cohanji Elementary School, which is no longer. Yeah, youngest of 4 kids. I had 2 older brothers, and it's actually sort of when I first got involved in newspapers in any way, is that my older brothers had a newspaper route, and when they were ready to give it up, I insisted on taking it over. So really, my mom deserves credit, because I often didn't wake up in the morning, and I was afraid of dogs, and I was a terrible, terrible news carrier. But yeah, I used to deliver The Day, I think, when I was like 12 years old.
And when you graduated from college, The Day was the only paper you applied to, is that correct?
Well, basically, I was one of these kids in college who didn't really, I was interested in a lot of different things, which anyone who's a journalist will tell you is actually a sign that you should be a journalist.
Right.
So I had like 2 majors and a minor and a concentration, and then I got out into the world, and I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I always liked to write. I wasn't a journalism major. I never took a class in journalism. I went to the University of Connecticut, and ended up at a newspaper called the Waterford Times, covering my hometown. Yeah, for some reason, the editor there saw something in me and thought I would know what I was doing, which I did not, and hired me to write about Waterford, my hometown. And eventually, you know, the Waterford Times got bought out by that entire group of papers got bought out by the Day. So my biggest, like goal in life was I want to work for the Day. I want to be a reporter at the Day. And I worked my tail off to try to convince them that they should let me write for the Daily, the big Daily, and that I could break news. And they hired me originally to cover Waterford.
What becomes important later in your career is that Waterford is home to the Millstone Nuclear Power Station. And later when you work for Chicago, that becomes really important. But I won't get too much ahead of it. What I remember from your career, besides the fact that you had so much energy covering cops and courts, which is a really tough beat. It's deadline all the time and lots of moving parts, is that a big story you ended up investigating was a precursor to the financial crisis in 2008. You got a letter and discovered by doing some old-fashioned journalism that there were mortgage loans being given to people who should not ever have gotten a mortgage. They were getting $200,000 loans when they made minimum wage. Can you tell me a little about that?
Yeah, I mean, this was, at the time I'm a crime beat reporter, right? So I'm listening to the police scanner and running out to fires and murders and all sorts of, things, which is a pretty intense beat when you cover a community.
Yes.
And, in the middle of all this, one of the editors said to me, "Oh, we got this letter in the mail and, no one's quite had time to look into it." And I look at it and it's this letter saying, there's this very complicated scheme going on in the real estate market, and that I should look into it. So I try calling the phone number on the letter, and it doesn't work. It doesn't go to anybody. So I stop for a second and I look and I see that there's an address, a return address, and it's right up the street from the Day. So I just walked up there and knocked on the door. It was this real estate agent who had been watching this go down in the community. And, he started helping me find sort of victims of this scam. Essentially, people were sort of hoodwinked into buying houses that they sometimes didn't even realize they were buying. They didn't understand the paperwork they were filling out. There was this one lender who would tell them like, "Hey, I can get you into a house. You could just, you can just pay me the rent." And meanwhile, he was using their credit and just flipping these houses. And there was a whole list of people involved in the scam. It was a really incredible story, and really helped launch my career further because the Attorney General got involved, and eventually, like 11 people went to prison because of those stories. Yeah.
200 different fraudulent loans were involved. One guy was making millions of dollars off this. Great story, went on for a long time. And it kind of gave me, at the time, it made my hair stand on end. And lo and behold, a year later, we found a whole lot of subprime mortgages were happening all over the country, just like that. So you were ahead of the curve, as they say.
Yeah, I mean, I always remember going to this guy's house that he had just bought. And, supposedly he had put down like $20,000 as a down payment on the house. And he's standing on the deck of this house, holding the check that was supposed to go to the bank. And he's telling me, "I don't have this money. We just took, they told me just to make a photocopy of it." And so the money, it was just just the beginning of what turned out to be, you know, all the cracks in the system that really did lead to the financial crisis. And I was just seeing it right in the local housing market.
Amazing story. So you had a brief stint at Conn College, but then your then husband wanted to go to grad school in Chicago, and you end up in Chicago with absolutely no job. What do you do? And the recession has hit. 2009 was not exactly a stellar year to get a job. What did you do?
Yeah, it was a really smart idea. We moved to Chicago in 2009, right? In the middle of this horrible job market. And he's a student and I have no job at all. And I had this idea, like maybe this was like when blogs were really big.
Right.
So I said, maybe I can have a blog about looking for a job, and then maybe somehow I'll get a job. And so I kind of stalked this guy who was starting a blog network for the Chicago Tribune and convinced him to put my blog, which I called the Job Stalker, on the blog network, and just was writing about how hard it was looking for a job and what it was like at the job fairs, and sometimes just silly posts about my life. You know, and somebody read it at the Tribune and sent me an internal email with the, you know, what jobs were being posted. And I just sent, you know, just blind my package of clips to this editor in the business section, where I'd never done, in my mind, business reporting before. And he read it and he called me up and he called me in for an interview. And it was like the most exciting day of my life. I couldn't keep in my enthusiasm that I had gotten an interview at the Chicago Tribune. And it turns out that one of the editors in that section also had been a cops reporter. So he liked just kind of chatting with me about, he's like, you know, I think cops reporters make the best business reporters, which now I also feel that way about. And yeah, he loved me and I got hired, and then my career went in that direction. I started writing about money.
So you told me an interesting factoid about Illinois, that it's got more nuclear plants than any other state.
That's right.
So actually your influence, your experience as a town reporter in Waterford came in handy.
That's right. I mean, when I was covering Waterford, I got really into the nuclear power plant, because anyone who's lived in Waterford knows it's a big thing in the community. It provides a lot of taxes. It's very controversial. It provides a lot of jobs. So I knew quite a lot about nuclear power. And then it turns out Fukushima happens. And all of a sudden the Tribune's looking around for someone who knows anything about nuclear power. And I raised my hand and I said, I know a lot about nuclear power. And just started covering the heck out of nuclear power. And it really, it created this niche for myself in that job, where I just got to start writing about anything related to electricity and power and utilities, which maybe from where you're sitting doesn't sound that interesting, but it is a super fascinating space that like affects every one of our lives.
And it's money, baby. I mean, there is a huge amount of money involved. And oftentimes reporters overlook something like that because it's really complicated. It's very dry and it's a little hard to get into. But if you get into it, there's so much money involved that it's got to be interesting. I mean, you know, there's corporations and I think sometimes corporations depend on people being turned off by the complexity. But if you can make it simple for people, they can see the importance of the story.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that's sort of glorious that I love about reporting is that often you go into a topic and you think that you understand what the story is. And then the more you learn about it, the more you realize that, you know, that's not the story, or there's a lot more to things than you realize. I mean, I remember, you know, writing about a wind farm that was going up in a town, and it seemed like this great thing for the community. There was tons of money involved. All these farmers were getting, you know, tons of money just to put one of these wind turbines on their farm. But what it turned into was like, it just completely tore apart this community. Like people were at each other's throats, that they wouldn't say hi to each other anymore. And these are like really small towns. You know, somebody got chosen for the amount of wind on their property and another person didn't. And then, you know, people were angry because they had to live in the shadow of the turbine, but didn't actually get the money or the turbine. So yeah, it just like, it just goes on and on and on. There's so many layers to this stuff that it really is incredible. You could write about it forever.
So you're in Chicago, and you also got wind of a story of a car, an electric car being manufactured largely with, you know, you and I, the taxpayers, investing in a plant. And the car, as it turns out, is made up mostly of plastic. It's tiny, and its top speed is 65 miles an hour with a price tag of $40,000. Thank you very much. How did you get that story?
Yeah, don't you want to buy that? Doesn't that sound
Right.
fantastic?
Oh, God, yeah.
Love it. Yeah. Well, it was funny. There's near Chicago, there's a city called Elkhart, Indiana, that's like always trying to reinvent itself and has been many things over the years. And in this era that I was there, it was supposed to become the electric vehicle capital of the United States. And there was tons of federal money being poured into vehicles and battery plants and all kinds of things to try to like boost the electric vehicle industry. So I thought there's a very big Amish population in Elkhart, Indiana. So I thought, oh, how cool would it be if there were like Amish people like riding up to this like plant to like build the electric vehicle of the future. And I had this whole idea in my head, which once again, like turns out you don't know the story until you get into it. And
Right.
for some reason, this company just wouldn't call me back. And that's strange, you know, like I feel like it's almost like advertising for them in their car. So I told my editor, I was like, something's up. I drove to Elkhart, Indiana. It was about, I think, an hour and a half away. And I actually knocked on the door of this electric vehicle plant. And this guy opens the door and there's like, he's just babysitting like hundreds and hundreds of these golf cart like electric cars. And there's no one else inside. And it just took me down this like rabbit hole where I learned that all these companies were actually going belly up. Their business models weren't making sense. There was a Russian oligarch involved who was like snatching up all these companies. We had like some pretty major battery firms that couldn't survive, that got snatched up by Chinese firms. And so it was a real lesson in, you know, like you think that this all makes sense at the outset, and you think like, oh, America's supporting all these things, but then if the businesses don't make sense, that it ultimately leads to, you know, ended up in foreign hands.
Right. And what I liked about the story is, in both of the stories we talked about, is that you got up from your desk, you got in your car, you drove somewhere and you knocked on the door. Or in the first story, you just walked down the street. But so often journalists, you know, with our wonderful, you know, internet and ways of communicating at our fingertips, they don't get up and go somewhere. And sometimes that's the only way to get a story.
Yeah, and I do think that you can actually end up, I don't know why I keep using the word hoodwinked, but hoodwinked, if you don't do that. Like, I think it's very easy for things to be hidden if you don't take the time to actually go check it out yourself. You know, they always say in journalism, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Right. I think that's true. You gotta go see it if you can with your eyes.
So how did you end up you're in Chicago Tribune, life is good, you know, you're a big shot at a big paper. How did you end up at the Wall Street Journal, which is even a little bit more cool?
Different cool. Yeah. Well, I actually was pretty happy at the Tribune, and, you know, I liked my beat, and, you know, I felt like I was a little bit of a star at that point. But, you know, my family's out east, my home's out east, and one of my friends and I had been talking about maybe I should go at some point, you know, I'll go back to the East Coast. And she saw a job opening at the Journal covering the oil markets. And I thought, well, that's adjacent, you know, I'm writing about energy. Yeah. So I applied, and, you know, I wrote this like, you know, fabulous cover letter, and I did get a call back. And basically got to the point where they were calling my references, and then all of a sudden everything stopped. And I was like, what happened? And apparently there was, right in the middle of me getting hired, there was hiring freeze. So I ended up just continuing to work at the Tribune for, I think, like another year. And then out of the blue, I get a call from an editor at the Journal, and he's like, I want to hire you. Can you tell me by Monday? It's for a job covering the soft commodities, which I had no idea what that was. I had to Google it. And then I was like, yes, I mean, you know, basically I consulted everyone in the world that I care about. And they were like, do you want to go to New York? Do you want to try working at a publication where you can go work in other countries and do like cover the world? And I said, yeah, hell yeah. So whatever the soft commodities are, I'm in, you know, and I moved to New York.
And that's like oranges and what are soft commodities? For
Yeah,
those?
it turns out that they should just call it what it is, which is it's orange juice, like frozen concentrated orange juice, coffee, cocoa, sugar, and cotton. I think I got them all.
Well, we use those, everybody uses those every day, so it doesn't look like a sexy beat, but you could make it, you know, interesting, right?
Yeah. I mean, at the beginning, you know, it was tough. It was really hard. Like I was like, I had to learn about commodity markets and all these things I'd never learned. It was like maybe one of the biggest learning curves I've ever gone through. And then I'm at this massive organization and I'm a small fish in this big pond, you know, and I'm learning how to pitch stories and I'm writing about some of the least, you know, important, I think, in their minds, markets. You know, it's not like I'm writing about the dollar or oil or things you read about every day. But honestly, by the end of it, I was writing some of the most fun stories in that section. You know, I mean, I got to go to a secret orange grove in Florida, and I wrote about like people like shoving pigs into the backs of their Prius because like they liked the fattier pigs more than the other. I mean, just like anything that you can imagine goes on in agriculture, and it's fascinating, and it's also like, it's the world. I mean, you know, these things that we eat, the things that create our clothing are coming to us from India and Brazil and China. So that really opened the whole world to me.
So I'm burying my lead, of course. We all want to know how you got to China and what you did when you got there. Waterford girl.
Yeah, so I think that my move to China was very surprising, maybe to everyone except me. I ended up being asked to write about what they call emerging markets. It's developing countries and, you know, their financial systems. And so I was in this newsroom where I was surrounded by people who were focused on the United States, focused on United States stock market, the dollar, you know, US treasuries, things like that. Whatever the president was saying, anything. And I'm writing about Mozambique and Venezuela and India and Brazil and Argentina and then all these like quirky things like orange juice. And you know, I just got to this point where I was like, I'm in New York and I'm listening to investors talk every day about these countries and especially China, because it turns out that China financially is very involved in every country in the world. And I just thought, wouldn't it be more fun if I actually went and lived in one of these countries and reported from there? So the Journal, thankfully, is a really great organization for, you know, like career development. You can go up to your editor and say, all right, I want to try something different. So I started, you know, calling around to different editors all over the world and trying to find out what the opportunities were. And one of the corporate editors, someone I really respect, she said, well, I think you should call Beijing. And I said, China? I don't know, like China's like, it's another planet so far away. I can't imagine doing that. And I did. I said, I'll look into it, called up the editor, and he just made it sound like the most amazing thing that would ever happen to me. Like that it was going to be biggest adventure of life. It would be life-changing. I would know so much more about every single thing that I report on from now on. And that it would also just be the time of my life. So I went for it. started learning Chinese. Yeah.
And so you moved to Beijing, and then we're in 2018 now, right?
Yeah. So in 2018 is when I started going through the incredibly lengthy visa process and everything. Started taking Chinese and getting ready to go. Yeah, it was, it's a long process to get to China.
Right.
So you're sort of in limbo for months while you sort of wait to see if the government wants to allow you in.
So what surprised you the most once you got there?
I think this is gonna sound strange, but maybe how happy I was. Because it was
Nice.
this, I'm in this like place where I don't speak the language, everything's unfamiliar. And, I've been through a lot of transitions in my life, I've lived in different cities and jobs, and usually the first few months are really, really, really hard, and you don't know anyone, and you're lonely, and you don't know what you're doing yet, and you just have to figure it out. And when I got to Beijing, I almost immediately just fell in love with it. I had just an amazing time. The people, the expat community there are all these people who are, super brilliant and good at their jobs. And, they're not in China for the lifestyle. They're there because they have something that they're passionate about. And I felt like I found a lot of like-minded people. I really enjoyed learning the language. It was super hard, but every time I said any words and someone understood them, it just felt like a huge reward. It was like opening up an entirely new world. So it was a place that really called to me, and that every day was different and endlessly fascinating. And I guess I'm not really answering the question. Maybe what was the most surprising thing? I guess that you can live in a place that, in some ways is like a totalitarian state and forget that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's little moments. Obviously when COVID broke out, that was another thing, but there's little moments that break through that remind you like, oh, this is a different system of government in every way. This is not America. Things don't work that way. And so you'd have these moments throughout your day, or sometimes, throughout your week, that would just wake you up and remind you that you're in China.
Can you give me an example?
I guess this example I would use is, I remember maybe a month in, there's this big political event going on. And whenever that happens, the government sort of rounds up all the ne'er-do-wells so that everybody's on their best behavior in Beijing. Looks beautiful, right? So I'm walking down the street and I see a woman who drives what they call tuk-tuk. It's like a little cart. And she gets suddenly a car full of men drive up and just snatch her out of her vehicle, drag her screaming in broad daylight across the street, shove her in the back of a van, and drive off. And there's 50 people around. And I'm like, oh my God. I try to look at the license plate, but there's a character on it I don't recognize, and I'm too early on to understand what's going on. And I end up looking around, and everyone's acting like nothing happened. I'm like, this is horrible. We have to do something. This is crazy. And I call up my editor, who is an old China hand, had been there 25 years. And I said, I just saw a woman getting she just got kidnapped in front of my eyes. And I don't know what to do. And what should I go to the police? I don't, I don't speak the language. And he says, well, if you're Chinese, you just go about your day. And if you're American, I guess you could go to the police. But really, ultimately, it wasn't clear. It sounded like they were the police. They were the police who decided to grab her off the street. So she did show up later. She showed back up. That's the good end of the story. After the political event was over, and she sort of she talked to a friend of mine there, who they had a little conversation, and she said, well, it was not. It was just, this is what happens. This is what happens. And there was a lot of that kind of thing that would happen. Where you could watch the internet and articles and things just disappear before your eyes, on a daily basis. The censorship was also quite something that you didn't you know,
Mm.
you couldn't ignore. Yeah.
So when did you start hearing about the virus?
We started, I think I'll have to check myself on this, but one of our reporters like broke the story about it. I think it was in December.
Mm-hmm.
And like, it wasn't immediately apparent, you know, whether this was a really big deal. And then it was, it was. Yeah, very quickly, which I think is a little bit like what's happening. You know, this has been replicated all over the world, this kind of reaction, right? Where you saw it happen in China, and then it was there.
And so you mentioned to me that it was almost lucky that it happened around Chinese New Year's because everybody had a lot of food.
Yeah, it was a strange time because people, it's a holiday time it's almost like a month in China where everyone goes home to their families, and you know, everyone has tons of food on hand in their houses. Usually a lot of people eat out and they get takeout. It's really cheap there. So yeah, they were at the beginning having a lot of the same kind of like food shortage, food supply chain issues. But fortunately people had food on hand, and then the government is, you know, one of the fortunate things about living in a country where, you know, the government can like just act. They very quickly, you know, like got everyone involved in making sure people got food. But the unfortunate thing about this happening during Chinese New Year is that there were millions of people. I mean, Chinese New Year, they call it like the biggest migration of humans every year. It's how many people are traveling. So now, unlike in the past, Chinese are huge international travelers as well. So you've got people traveling, the biggest travel time of the year happening at a time where people don't realize what they're carrying home. And it was that part of it ended up being, as you know, incredibly devastating.
So at this point, how long have you been in China?
So I had, when we were like at the height of this crisis, I had been in China about a year. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And is that kind of a story that just kind of creeps along, inches along, or does it suddenly one day did it kind of blow up?
Yeah, it was, I would say it was more the latter. And the crazy thing is it blew up at a time where all my colleagues were also like on vacation. So we were all, and then wherever we were, we had to stay because it was like you couldn't get back to Beijing. There were so many restrictions. So at one point I was stuck in Paris. Then I was stuck in Hong Kong. All my Chinese colleagues were in their hometowns scattered all over China trying to report on this. And so it was like, we were all working remotely, not necessarily because we had a work from home order, but because we were remote from each other. So we refer to that time as I think the time of the fog, because I couldn't tell you what happened for 2 weeks straight. I mean, I was working so much, so many hours. It was endless. It was relentless. I fell asleep writing stories. It was just an incredible just onslaught of just horrific news. And my colleagues are incredible. I mean, we had people in the epicenter of Wuhan covering things from there. They were in hospitals in like full, you know, protective gear, getting stories. They broke just so many stories in very difficult conditions. I mean, this isn't a country where they have a huge love for foreign journalists. So everywhere you go, you know, you might be followed, you might be watched. I had a couple of colleagues who were trapped inside a hotel outside of Wuhan for weeks, had to get evacuated by the US government back to the United States. It was a very intense time.
So you were in Paris covering a story, and did you manage to get back to Beijing?
Yeah, so when I was in Paris, I had a sort of a strange, it was at the point in time in China where there was a shortage of masks and protective gear and hand sanitizer and all the same things that have happened here. And so while I was there, I was covering stories also related to China from Paris. Our global head of security asked me if I could become like someone who could get masks. Basically, I had to like go from pharmacy to pharmacy trying to acquire masks for our people and hand sanitizer. And at that point, there was already a run on those supplies in Paris, mostly from Chinese tourists who were there during the New Year and knew what was happening at home. So yeah, I mean, Paris doesn't even know what hit them, because by the time it got to them, all that stuff was gone. It had been taken. So I had to go, I eventually found this pharmacist in Paris who was ready, like everyone else you could only buy 5 masks at a time. And this guy suddenly was like, I can only sell you 10,000 masks or nothing. So next thing you know, like I'm wheeling and dealing with this weird pharmacist in Paris, and I end up like doing a deal and getting like 5,000 masks and becoming like a mule to get them back to our colleagues in Beijing. You couldn't ship them. Things were getting confiscated and stolen. We had at that point emptied out our office in Hong Kong and turned it into basically just like a landing site for supplies. And, you know, we were putting them into individual kits and then sending them with a person who was allowed into China to get into our coworkers. And so that was me. I like showed up with 2 huge duffel bags in Beijing and walked through customs and, you know, ended up getting some supplies to our coworkers.
So is there anything in your experience in China that is a predictor of what we're experiencing? We're all in lockdown. We're all trying to come out of that. You must feel like it's Groundhog's Day. You had the preview of all this early on. Is there anything you're waiting? Is there any shoe to drop that you're waiting for that we don't know about?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, maybe it's a controversial take, but yeah, I've been living through this thing like twice as long. And obviously in very different environments. I mean, in Beijing, things were so locked down. And so, you know, you could see people sanitizing things. You weren't allowed to have friends in your apartment. You were getting your temperature checked every few feet. You had, they have tracking now so that, you know, you get like a green code if you're healthy, and if you went to Wuhan, you've been tested and you can show that you are, you know, negative for the virus. So there's a lot of things that I assume will come in our future, but there are other things that are very China specific, where, you know, I guess every country around the world right now is trying to decide, how do we deal with this virus within the ethics and ideals of our society, in our political system. So within China, you know, it's a place where, you know, there's no expectation of privacy. People, you know, didn't have a choice about wearing a mask in public. They had to wear a mask in public. And, you know, throughout the crisis in Beijing, at least, there were restaurants open and bars. And when you went to them, they were at very low capacity, and you saw people, you know, you always saw everything being sanitized. Your temperature was checked before you went in the restaurant. You gave over, you know, all of your information. And, you know, I was going to work by the end of this. I was using share bikes. I was seeing friends. I was eating out. These things were possible in a society where you felt like you knew that everything was very, very, very locked down and safe. I don't think that the United States is going to be that way. I don't think that's in our DNA to you know, be as regulated and watched as you are in China. But I do think that there is a way for us to live in this environment and go outside and work and try to live somewhat normal lives as much as we can, because this thing is not, it's not going away for some time. And, you know, I did see how that's possible in China, but I am curious to see exactly how America will do it in an American way.
There's a lot of tension between the surveillance that the Chinese reaction requires and the individualism and the freedoms and all that stuff that we're accustomed to.
That's right. I mean, I've often wondered how this all would have played out if it hadn't started in China, right? I mean, the rest of the world had the luxury, I guess, of watching China's response to this, and then I feel like, not without exception, but basically people are trying on that kind of strategy to various degrees, and to some of them are, you know, failing and some of them are not. I always wonder what would have happened if, you know, every country somehow in their own universe had come up with their own strategy separate from China, and what the world would have looked like then. People could be quite innovative, I think, if you don't give them the solution in advance.
Now, you were expelled from China along with a whole bunch of colleagues and a number of newspapers. Are you going? Do you have any idea? Can you get back, or what's in the tea leaves for you?
You know, I'd love to go back. I don't know that that's in the tea leaves, at least in any time soon. You know, the political situation between the United States and China has become, you know, they're increasingly separated. And now with COVID on top of that, they couldn't be more far apart. You know, the members of the U.S. Embassy basically fled the country when things were bad in China. There's not really, we have a lot less of a presence there. And the way these things work, typically, you know, kind of once you leave, it's much more difficult to get back in. So I think that, you know, we'll have to see how the political environment plays out, you know, how the election plays out, if that has anything to do with China's views about U.S. journalists. But at the moment, I think we're probably assuming that I am not going to be in China. That doesn't mean that I might not cover China. We have right now we have this really interesting kind of global bureau covering China. People who used to be in Beijing are covering it from Tokyo in Australia, and I think Singapore, you know, just various places where they're sort of within that time zone, and we're just still breaking really amazing stories. So I'm really proud of those guys.
So what should Americans know about China that most Americans don't know?
That, you know, China's how do I say that? China's a place like America in some ways, that like the people are not the government, right? They have their, you know, people are funny and they have hopes and dreams and, you know, weird hobbies and all the things that we do. A lot of the humanity that I'm seeing right now in America are a lot of the same things that I saw when I was in China. You know, people talking about having time with their families, that, you know, that weirdly this whole situation allowed us to like become closer with people that we really care about. You know, people had their kids stuck at home with them and they were trying to do these Zoom classes. People got really into cooking. All of the things that I'm seeing in America happened to the people in China. And I do think that sort of like humanity crosses all sorts of boundaries. I also think that China is a place you can't ignore. It's no longer okay to ignore China. China is someplace that I think everybody needs to learn about. They're wildly important to the global economy. And, you know, whether you agree with, you know, some of their politics or not, it's something that the more you understand about it, I think the better off everyone will be. They're not going away. And right now, the way things look, they've got so much, they've gotten so much further along in terms of like dealing with the virus that if anything, you know, we might see them grow. So that's my 2 cents.
Maybe there's some things we can learn from them about coping with this.
I'm jumping in. These are
Welcome
wonderful
back.
questions. We've got a couple from our audience, so I think we're going to go there. Maura can rest for a moment. The first question says, there was the Chinese doctor who wanted to warn people about the disease, who seemed to be silenced by the government and eventually died. How was that received while you were in China, or were you even there then at that time, or aware of it?
I was there then. Yeah, Dr. Lee, that was one of the more interesting things that's like a real change in China. China's sort of been criticized as a place where it's very difficult to be like a political animal, and kind of, you know, any kind of dissent is usually quashed rather quickly. But this was a situation where people, when they found out that this doctor had tried to warn people about the disease and that he had been, you know, silenced, they were outraged. And it was something that the government really couldn't quash. And they eventually sort of like changed their stance on him, which I very rarely would see in China, you know, where they were like, suddenly he was a hero. And I think that was a moment where the government feared that they might have lost control of their people and the agenda, and pivoted. So it was a really big deal. I mean, when he died, you know, I remember like my Chinese colleagues were, you know, I was crying, they were crying. It was such an emotional time. And everybody took to the internet and wanted to talk about it.
Was that a form of protest? The mourning, was the mourning a form of protest in a way?
Yeah, it's a little bit, yeah, it's hard. Yeah, that's a good question, Maura. It's a little hard to explain, but in China, that's like a movement. I mean, that kind of thing happening where people are just openly, we also saw other things like that where some, you know, there was other doctors who were trying to speak out, and like this, they couldn't get past the censorship. Things were getting like taken off the internet, and you saw Chinese netizens figuring out these like really creative ways to keep sending that message out. Like they would put it in a song, or they'd write it like in backwards, so that the characters wouldn't get picked up by the censors. I mean, there was definitely like fascinating, innovative kind of political movement happening within China during this time, where people were like, no, I won't be silenced.
Wow.
The next question is, Julie, would you go through the chain of events and retaliation that led to your expulsion with the other US journalists?
Well, I can't go into it too much, mostly because I'm a little bit concerned about other American journalists that are still there and the future of journalism inside China. But generally, I would say that ultimately, we had a few of our journalists expelled who were some of our best journalists. Donald Trump was angry about that and retaliated by expelling some Chinese journalists from the United States. And then President Xi retaliated against that and just kicked everybody out. So that's generally the chain of events.
The next question comes from someone who says, N-I-H-A-O, which I assume is a Chinese greeting. He says in the 90s, he was fortunate. Ni hao, yeah.
Ni hao.
If I said it, you'd all just make fun of me.
I thought it was an acronym. I'm like, I'm not that cool.
No, sorry about that. I blew it. In the 90s, he was fortunate to work on a documentary for WSJ-TV. So I assume that's Wall Street Journal TV, with Bureau Chief Jim McGregor, who taught us the phrase, I'm going to spell the phrase again, M-E-I. The next word is B-A-N-F-A. Mibanfa? Something like that? Nothing can be done. Nothing can be done.
Okay.
He says, is that phrase still part of the Chinese vernacular, especially in COVID-19 times?
Oh, interesting. The one I would hear, There are a lot of phrases that I could have like a whole Zoom about the awesome phrases in Chinese. I don't know if I know that one, but there was like one of them is like guanxi, which is like it's sort of like, you know, I rub your back, you rub mine, like there's a way to get it done kind of thing. There's another one that they would say, like often if I was trying to schedule an interview and they just didn't want to do it for whatever reason, they never would just say no. They would say it's not convenient. So like that was a big one. You would say like, you know, and it could be any number of, a lot of times it wasn't convenient because it was a bad time politically for someone to be talking to a foreign journalist. And, you know, rather than say, you know, nobody comes out and says that. No one says like, I'm concerned, you know, that the government would be angry at me because that put them in jeopardy. They just say it's not convenient. Yeah. So yeah, there's tons of phrases out there that I could just go on and on.
A little more subtle.
Yes.
What's that?
And go ahead, Maura, what was that?
Is it a little more subtle? Are there nuances in language that we seem to be a little blunter than they are?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you got to realize like this is a country that some incredibly traumatizing events have happened in people's lifetimes, right? So you've got, you know, the Cultural Revolution where, you know, you couldn't even trust your own neighbor, sometimes your own family, people were attacking each other. You had mass starvation within their people's lifetime. So people are quite careful. They're very careful with their language. They're careful who they trust. It's a little bit, you know, maybe a little bit less so with some of the younger generations, but yeah, language is not something you play with. It's particularly on the internet.
I bet.
Yeah.
Another question, did you end up reporting on any nuclear power issues while you were in China?
You know, I didn't. I forgot to mention my beat there was oddly, it was not a very political beat at all, or, you know, we had a natural resources reporter and somebody wrote about energy, but like my beat was actually the most fun. I was writing about the consumer market, which is just like what people are buying and, you know, what they're eating and wearing. So I just had the most fun. I was writing about like these live streaming personalities who like spend like 16 hours a day live streaming themselves in order to sell clothing. I got to write about people drinking this craze for tea that has cream cheese on top, and some bubble in a sneaker trading market. Like people were trading sneakers back and forth for like thousands and thousands of dollars, and the government had to clamp down on it. I mean, it was so fun, but I never wrote about nuclear power.
Someone else asked, do you think the virus stopped the protests in Hong Kong?
You know, that's really funny. I remember when the virus first broke out, I was like, when is someone going to come up with this conspiracy theory that this was all just to stop the protests in Hong Kong? Because the Hong Kong protests at that time just seemed like there was a stalemate. It was endless. It wasn't going to end, and then it escalated. And then all of a sudden this disease shows up where you can't congregate. So Hong Kong literally like almost overnight went from making face masks illegal because it was a part of this protest movement where people were wearing masks to protect themselves against tear gas and all sorts of things, to it being required to wear a mask in public. And that was, yeah, I mean, that really changed the course of history there. But I don't think the Hong Kong issue is going away, but it might be, some of it's in hibernation.
On hiatus for a little while.
Right.
The next question I have is, what would you say is the biggest difference between Chinese and American journalism outside of government interference, of course? Are there some differences that you see?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's a great question. So China is the first place I ever obviously worked where, you know, the media is owned by the state. It's a government entity, which I don't think people in the US realize how lucky we are that that is not the situation here. And it's not just China. There's many countries around the world where, you know, it's state media. They call, you know, they have what they call the propaganda department, right? And so there were some amazing Chinese journalists who were trying to do the best they could to do like real reporting from inside these state media organizations. But it's incredibly difficult. So you had to almost like, sometimes you'd read these stories and you really needed to pick up on very subtle things that they were trying to do to tell the truth. And there are some great journalists in state media, there really are, and a lot of them end up trying to become, researchers at foreign news organizations so that they can do, more, reporting that's not controlled by the state. But ultimately, if you're a Chinese citizen, you're not allowed to do any kind of independent reporting for foreign media. And I have some very brave colleagues, is what I'll say.
Yeah. And that says it all, doesn't it? We're going to go ahead and wrap up. You're in Chicago now. Any upcoming stories you want to give us a tip on that you're following?
Yeah, well, I jumped in on, basically I'm writing about how COVID is impacting business, but I've jumped in on this really, really amazing team that's writing about the food industry, food supply chain. So things like, how the meat packing plants are dealing with so many COVID cases. They've got, I wrote a story about this huge battle about restaurant delivery, and working on stories about all these restaurants and how they're trying to survive. And it's, some people are saying maybe only 25%, that like 25% of restaurants are just never going to reopen after this. So yeah, it's been really interesting covering it from the food supply chain side, because it's something I also covered in China, and I get to see the differences between how America's handling it and how China did.
Indeed. I'm going to say thank you, but before I thank our panelists, I want to really thank our audience for hanging in there with us through our technical difficulties tonight. We know where the challenge was, so we can fix it in the future. So we appreciate your graciousness more than I can say, but even more so, we appreciate Maura and Julie for spending this last hour and 15 minutes with us, telling these stories. We can see why they are good journalists. We can see why journalism, again, is so important to us everywhere that we live. So with that, here's the silent applause. And thank you very much. I'm ending the meeting, and we will have this recorded on our YouTube channel, hopefully in the next week. We can figure that out. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Maura and Julie.
Thanks, Maura.
Bye.
Bye-bye.